Hey everybody, we're in week 11. We're talking about the British invasion. So let's back up for 1 second. We talked a couple weeks ago about how after World War II, the soldiers who were lucky enough to survive the war, they came home and life settled back down. Everyone kind of wanted to be back to normal. They wanted a predictable, non-risky way of living. And what wound up happening is everybody started popping out kids like crazy. And that brought us the baby boomer generation coming of age as teenagers right around the time when rock and roll, all those origins mixed together. The teenagers loved rock and roll. And for the first time ever, they wanted to be different than their parents. That we talked about all of that. So rock and roll dies. Boom, gone. There's a few people left, but all the big names, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis, like all those folks were incapacitated for one reason or another. Either in the case of Buddy Holly had passed away, or in the case of Elvis had gone off to war, but then was never quite as popular again. Chuck Berry going to prison, Little Richard becoming a preacher. All these things had happened. However, dun dun dun, thank goodness for rock and roll that England had been listening the entire time. My computer's freaking out. Okay, so I hope it's still recording. I think we're good. Anyway, I'm just gonna keep talking. So in England, across the ocean, there was a whole nother situation going on. England had gotten the snot kicked out of them in World War II. Why? England is right near Germany, much closer than the US anyway. So the British were fighting the war in their backyard. Like their cities were being bombed by German fighter pilots and all, like they were at war in their own country. And in the United States, we had the attack on Pearl Harbor, but for the most part, we were fighting the war in Europe. We weren't fighting it on the streets of New York City. You know what I mean? And in England, that was not the case. So we're talking about giant buildings that have been destroyed. Innocent civilians being just murdered by bombs, rationing of even after the war, even like several years after the war, still rationing food and supplies. Times are tough. People are poor. Unemployment is huge. So one of the few lights in people's lives at the time was listening to music and making music. And that is what winds up saving rock and roll in America. So I'm going to start reading. Here we go. After the death of rock and roll in the US, rock music was at a standstill. Culturally, the US had returned to the much safer styles of the wall of sound, doo-wop, and bubblegum pop, which we've talked about recently. Music that pushed the limits just was not being made in America at this time. Economically, many Americans were prospering after the war. There were many factory jobs, good wages, and people enjoying a normal life. The U.S. also had the good fortune of minimal damage to our land and infrastructure, which means like roads and bridges and buildings and stuff. Our biggest losses were in the lives of soldiers lost during battle, which of course was horrible. However, we were able to bounce back a little faster because all of our stuff hadn't been destroyed like it had been in a lot of places in England. England and many other European countries were crippled by the bombs and destruction of World War II. They had been fighting the fight in their own neighborhoods. Jobs were scarce, food was rationed, supplies were often hard to find. One of the few escapes young teenagers had from the depressing reality of their home lives was listening to American rock and roll. Liverpool, England, which we'll look at on the map here. So here's England, all right? This circle right here, this red circle, there's Liverpool. London's down over here. Okay, just to kind of give you some perspective. All right. So Liverpool was a seaport. Giant ships were built in Liverpool. I think a large portion of the Titanic was built in Liverpool. It was right on the water, and trade ships would come and go to England from Liverpool because it was right on the water. However, that also made them a target during World War II because the Germans wanted to disrupt the supply line, so they would bomb the crap out of Liverpool in an attempt to prevent them from being able to ship supplies for military purposes and trade purposes and all that. So, Liverpool, England was a hotbed of English rock and roll. It was a major seaport in Britain, and many new records came through there first. There are also many clubs in Liverpool that featured these bands. So, the sailors would travel all over the world on the ships, and they'd buy these records and bring them back to Liverpool, and people would imitate it. The British teens were listening via radio and records brought over on ships from the US. Many merchant sailors brought their records to England before they could be sold in the stores. That gave them, they were right on the cutting edge of new music in that way. These young teenagers started bands to lift their spirits and fill their time. There were no jobs to be had. Unemployment was through the roof. What else are you going to do? You might as well start a band, right? Learn to play the guitar, find some friends, make some music. Many started skiffle bands. Skiffle is a drummerless acoustic guitar / banjo music similar to bluegrass, but with a rock and roll feel. So if you mashed up rock and roll and bluegrass and people who don't have enough money to buy drum sets, you've got skiffle. Drums and electric instruments were expensive and hard to come by. All right, so what bands were these teenagers listening to? Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, Muddy Waters from the Blues, Little Richard, Elvis Presley. All these people, they were listening on the radio, soaking it up like sponges, copying their musical styles, and a lot of these skiffle bands were playing covers of their music. All right, so here next to the map, we have two examples of skiffle. One is by Lonnie Donegan, who is a very popular skiffle artist, and the other one is a band called the Quarrymen, playing a Buddy Holly cover. But the Quarrymen, 3 of them would go on to be Beatles. Hopefully you've all heard of the Beatles. I would hope so. If not, best day of your life, the first day you heard of the Beatles. Ringo of the Beatles had not joined them yet, but at the time, John, Paul, and George were in a band called the Quarrymen, and they recorded this song. Well, not in the studio. It's a rough recording, but it's them playing a Buddy Holly song. All right. So these pictures right here, I know they're black and white and not very clear, but this is mainly to show you the juxtaposition of what American day-to-day life was versus down here, Liverpool day-to-day life. Bomb buildings, kids literally playing in bomb sites for their playground. And opposed to America, where we've got this white picket fence, golden retriever, driving my car to the drive-in to go have a chocolate malt and listen to the jukebox. You know, like a very different experience was being had by kids in England and in Liverpool specifically we're talking about. So many of these British musicians saw America as a land of hope and prosperity, a land of money, a land of success. They saw visions of beaches, glamorous cities, Hollywood, fancy cars, food, and most importantly, it was the home of their musical heroes. These people in these skiffle bands, these kids who had nothing really to look forward to in life, bad situations at home and in their towns, they wanted nothing more than to go to America and to be in the land of prosperity and money and rock and roll and the home of their heroes. All right. The best market for this music was in the US. Groups that made it in England started trying to come over to America to make money and try and make it big. Music lovers in the US were so starved for fresh rock and roll that they freaked out at the arrival of these new artists. British band after British band started topping the US charts like never before. The first to arrive was Dusty Springfield, who is a female artist we will get to in a moment. But the gates burst open with the arrival of the Beatles on February 7th, 1964. All right, so these skiffle bands start popping up. Ones that start to do well eventually are able to play clubs and buy electric guitars, maybe find someone with a drum set, find someone with a bass guitar, and actually start playing, I'm not going to say true rock and roll, because skiffle's rock and roll-ish, right? But being able to play rock and roll in the way it was intended on electric instruments with drum kits, with bass guitars, all these things. They start making it. Once the bands made it big in Liverpool, they were trying to get over to the US because that's where the money was. People had the money to burn to buy these records, remember? Things are more prosperous. So Dusty Springfield was first, but then when the Beatles came to America, everyone was flipping out. It was Beatle mania, and they flipped out for these other bands too, and hopefully we can watch some clips from that at some point. Normally we watch a documentary about it, but I don't know if we'll be able to do that. So if you're in the AB cohorts, we might watch part of it. But I have no way of putting it online. I'm sorry, internet people. All right, so here are some of our Whodats for this week. I'm going to start here with Dusty Springfield. Again, these are on the website. You're going to look at the website, and you're going to label open with, annotate with Cami, and you're going to add text boxes, type underneath who these groups are. Okay? There's a bunch of them. Then down below, instead of definitions this week, you have some review questions. Okay? So you got these 9 review questions. Use text boxes in Kami and type them in. All right? Next, we have the listening jots. I know there's not a lot of room here. I apologize. Just make the boxes really long and thin and give me your... remember, don't just put, it's weird, it's slow. Don't put that. Put what you hear first. Starts with drums, has guitar solo, has group harmony, man has high voice, woman singing, makes me think of blah, blah, blah. Like, give me more detail. Don't just put it's weird. That doesn't mean anything, okay? Don't put that. If you put that, I'm just going to not give credit because it's ridiculous. All right. So you're going to listen to all these songs. I will email everyone the playlist because for some reason, Spotify is not showing on my playlist. So I will email you the British Invasion playlist. We have all these bands, and then we end with 3 Beatles songs. They're early Beatles songs, though. Early Beatles songs. Next week, we're going to do the Beatles by themselves, and we're going to talk more about middle and late Beatles, but and how they got started, their origin story. But for this week, it's just these 3 early ones. Okay. And again, these are all on the website. I might go double check the YouTube videos on the website right after I hang up this. And yeah, if you have any questions, email me. If you're having trouble finding the playlist, email me. I'm here to help you. All right. Have a good one. Bye-bye.